Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Ling, and this is The Road to a Vaccine, an exploration of the COVID-19 crisis and the global community's efforts to develop a vaccine against the disease. There is so much to talk about every week, and this one is no exception, as our White House here in the US has become a COVID hotspot of its own, as President Donald Trump and many of his aides have contracted the disease. The president is now back in the White House, which now has more cases than Taiwan, New Zealand, and Vietnam combined. Another reminder that the virus is still very much alive here in America. Let's take a look at the current numbers in the US and globally. This week, we are at over 35 million global confirmed cases and over 1 million global deaths. The US surged past 210,000 deaths, a sobering milestone as we head into the fall. More than 1,700 healthcare providers have died from COVID, according to National Nurses United. That includes more than 200 nurses, with 60% of them being people of color. And New York City's COVID daily positivity rate has topped 3%, the highest in months, attributable to cases rising in 9 zip codes. The CDC has updated their guidance on how the virus spreads to include airborne transmission. And a major development. J&J has joined the Gates Foundation and 15 other pharmaceutical companies to advance manufacturing and equitably distribute coronavirus vaccines. Here's J&J's chairman and CEO, Alex Gorsky, with the announcement made recently at the UN General Assembly.
Now, if and when our COVID vaccine is found to be safe and effective, Johnson & Johnson is committed to ensuring it is accessible globally. And as part of our commitment today, we plan to allocate up to 500 million vaccine doses to lower-income countries with delivery beginning mid-next year.
And that was Alex Gorsky. And in just a few minutes, we'll have Dr. Paul Stoffels here to talk about this more in detail. And today we'll also check in with what's happening in South Africa and talk to the leading expert of its team of COVID-19 advisors, Dr. Glenda Gray, and physician and author Dr. Matt McCarthy, who first rang the alarm bells about the lack of available testing for patients at hospitals in New York. And he'll be here to talk about whether the situation has changed and the potential implications of the recent uptick in cases there. But first, there have been so many major announcements, and with phase 3 clinical trials underway, I think it's a good time to check in with one of the world's busiest scientists, J&J's Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Paul Stoffels. Welcome, Dr. Stoffels. It's so nice to see you again. So what is the status? Everyone is so anxious to know of J&J's vaccine. It was announced a little over a week ago that J&J launched multi-country phase 3 ensemble clinical trials. So where are these happening, and what does it mean to be in phase 3?
So, Lisa, the last time we talked about the ongoing phase 1-2 studies where we tested the vaccine in 1,000 people, low dose, high dose, boosted, non-boosted, and we evaluated that the vaccine was safe and effective in at least on biomarker basis for going further in that study. And that came out later in September, where we discussed with the FDA, external scientists, and the community, the scientific community, that moving forward to phase 3. And so with all the constituents here, we made the decision of doing a study in 60,000 people, placebo-controlled, in order to show the activity of a single dose. The study has been kicked off and it's now rolling out over the world, and more than 200 centers in the world will participate. In the US, in South America, 6 countries, and then South Africa, and Glenda is here, we can talk about that later. So it's a global clinical trial, 60,000 people in a very diverse population to show efficacy and safety.
And Dr. Stoffels, at what stage are you in now? About how many people have been injected so far?
It's just at the start of the phase 3. So it's like a week ago, we kicked off the phase 3. The studies are starting up all over the world. People are brought into the study sites. Several hundred people have been vaccinated, but a big surge of the start of the study is going to be in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and hopefully recruiting the study within 2-month time frame, and then being able to get to an endpoint somewhere later or early next year, depending on the efficacy of the vaccine and of course the endpoints we can recruit.
And can you tell me about the significance of the single dose? I understand that a number of other companies are requiring multiple doses.
Yeah. The single dose is important we learned in the study that a single dose induces neutralizing antibodies as well as cellular immunity, and at a very significant level. That was correlated with studies we did in animals, where we could show that gave protection for disease as well as for transmission. And so a single dose is very important in a pandemic where you can get protection with one injection. Operational to call everybody 2 times to a site for vaccination is significant, and especially in many countries around the world with less, let's say, less equipped healthcare systems, a single dose could do a big thing to the vaccination levels in those areas. And so we'll study first a single dose. But of course, we're going to learn about boosting, because at the same time, we know that we need to get long-term protection, probably a few years before COVID is gone. And we are at the start of a very large-scale phase 3 program where we study both the single dose as well as boosted dose, as well as longer-term boosting after 6, 12, or 24 months.
And can you tell us how you are collaborating with other manufacturers and government agencies during this process?
Well, the collaboration with government agencies, first of all, is exceptional. The speed of which we can work now, it's almost on an ongoing basis. When we have data, they are immediately transmitted to the FDA, to regulators around the world who are part of the clinical trials and part of the decision making. And that allows to come to fast decisions. We do not cut corners here. All the data which we normally submit out of such a phase 1 study are already on the go, on the submission, before we even submit our final report, so that FDA and others can already make their evaluations. And then the decision and the discussion goes fast. At the moment you have to make the decision. There is a lot of preparation ongoing. You don't start the phase 3 study overnight. This is already going on from June, July, where we started preparing, looking for the sites in the world. Where is the epidemic going, with data scientists learning on where are the surge and how is that evolving? Because we need to recruit people in areas where there is transmission to prove to work, to learn whether a vaccine works. You have to have transmission. And that was several months preparation with the NIH, with Glenda, with others to make sure we do the right thing.
Dr. Stoffels, can you talk about the commitment last week to the Equitable Global Access Pledge, along with the Gates Foundation and the scientific community, in continuing this commitment to safety?
Yeah. Well, first, the commitment to safety is that there is a lot of push to get a vaccine fast. But we also, as a company and as a part of the scientific community, we are committed to bring a safe and effective vaccine. We have to have a minimal amount of safety, not a minimal, we have to have sufficient safety data in different parts of the population. The elderly, the people with comorbidities, women, men, African Americans, the people who are most vulnerable to the disease. And it's only then, when we have efficacy and safety data in those, that we will progress with a very significant expansion of providing it on a large scale. It's quite unique that you go from, let's say, 60,000 people study to hundreds of millions of people. Typically, a drug is introduced and goes. So that's why we have to be very sure that it's safe and effective. And we will do, the scientific community will judge, but then the FDA and the regulators around the world. And this is not a decision of one person. This is a decision of an entire community who make sure that a vaccine is safe and effective before it's used on a large scale. And then with regard to availability and being able to make a commitment of 500 million to the low-income countries, is that in parallel, we have been working on scaling up. So also starting in the beginning of the year, when we took the decision to start the vaccine, in parallel, we took the decision to have manufacturing sites up in all over the world. So US, Europe, now in India. And at the moment, we can make a commitment of more than 1 billion vaccines in the course of next year. We are working hard to further increase that. And as part of that, we commit to make 500 million available starting mid next year for starting in the Gavi countries, in the low income countries, and both for healthcare workers and vulnerable, and as it will go forward over the months, we will be able to vaccinate larger groups of people, always jointly with ministers of health and the healthcare community in each of the countries.
I want to remind those watching that if you have any questions for Dr. Stoffels or any of our other guests, please put them in the comment section and I'll try to get to them as best I can. Dr. Stoffels, I've heard that in order to get to large-scale manufacturing of the vaccine, you first have to get to emergency use authorization. So what exactly does that mean, emergency use authorization?
Emergency use authorization is a decision of the authorities of a country to deploy a vaccine fast for an emerging disease. And it's not the company can apply for that, but it's the country who decides whether yes or no to do an emergency use authorization. And that will most typically be done for higher risk people. The emergency use is typically done for those who are most at risk, who need a vaccination fast, and in medicines is typically for those who need new medicines fast. If we go to therapies, for example, in HIV or in cancer, when you have people who are at very high risk of dying, you can go faster with those therapies than if you go to the general population or to less sick people. The same here for vaccines. It will be, according to the country's laws and regulations, it will be for particular groups of people who can get access under emergency use. We as a company will go forward to full approval of the vaccine so that it can become generally available on a large scale, and that will follow the normal approval mechanisms. So,
and are the safety protocols exactly the same for emergency use versus general use?
The only difference there will be between emergency use and general use is there will be more time and more information being accrued over time, that there will be more information for general use than for emergency use. But still, there is a very significant amount of information going to be available for emergency use authorization also. It's not over one night that will go. Let me add one more thing. In the meantime, we have been able to vaccinate more than 110,000 people with the same vector, with that platform, in RSV, in Ebola, in HIV, in Zika, and that also gives additional comfort to safety. And so that we can add another safety database from other vaccines to what we learn with the COVID vaccine, which hopefully will get to about 60,000 people before we will largely deploy it.
Dr. Stoffels, I have a question from Ephraim from LinkedIn, who asks, there's news that the virus is mutating, becoming stronger. Is this being taken into account during the process of finding a vaccine?
Well, we are watching that very carefully, and we know of one big mutation which happened, and we tested already that, and the vaccine is efficacious. The vaccine is efficacious for that mutation. Of course, we'll now have to watch very careful as new therapies are being introduced and other vaccines, that there could be more mutations. And then we have to absolutely be ready to adapt or to make a multivalent vaccine as that would happen.
As you embark upon this massive 60,000 person trial, is there a way to estimate how long the trial could take if everything goes as hoped or as planned?
Yeah, our teams, we have, let's say, clinical trials is a second nature. We have to do for every drug we bring, every vaccine, we do clinical trials. So almost half of what we do in our scientific work is clinical trials. So typically we do between 100, 300,000 patients a year in clinical trials for many different reasons, for many different diseases and drugs. And so we have a lot of experience with large trials. The network, the HVTN network and the COVID-PN network now, they have experience with very large clinical trials since a long time. So the collaboration between the clinical trial networks and us as an industry that's very well established, and we can count on both the clinical trial networks as well as the capabilities in the company to deal with 60,000. It's big. I can't deny that. But a vaccine is also a single administration, and therefore it's easier, operational. But the data and the work we have to generate and the work we have to do is you can't believe what needs to happen. It's big.
Well, I have kind of a personal question for you. I mean, you and your team of scientists have dedicated your lives to science and public health. We've talked to quite a number of them on our show, and you've just been working tirelessly over the past 8 months on this COVID vaccine. So how does it feel to finally be in the midst of phase 3 clinical trial?
Well, it's grateful that we have the science and we have been able to develop the science and the technology to do this. On the other hand, it's daunting because the responsibility which comes with it, on taking something on like this, people are really waiting for a vaccine at the moment. Even more and more at this moment with the surge all over the world, people start to see that if we don't find other tools to combat the pandemic, we are not going to get there and going to get it under control. And that's where a big responsibility comes. But it's with all of us, whether we are in a pharmaceutical or whether you are in a clinical trial center or in a hospital, it's a very big responsibility at the moment for public health, and it's daunting to see the surge again. And so, yeah, at the same time grateful, but also feeling a big responsibility to bring a vaccine which is effective for eventually stopping the pandemic.
I have another question from Alician. Is it important for COVID survivors to donate antibodies?
Well, in certain countries, as long as there are no antibodies made and produced, it depends on whether it's at the moment approved or used or practical and studied enough to do that. At a certain point, it could become critical to have antibodies available, a convalescent serum to use, and maybe the clinicians later can talk more about that.
Well, Dr. Stoffels, it goes without saying that we are all wishing you luck. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and we look forward to talking to you in the coming weeks. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, in case you've just joined us, we are live, and this is the Road to a Vaccine. If you have any questions of our guests, please post them in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get them answered. Our next guest is Dr. Glenda Gray, CEO and President of the South African Medical Research Council. She co-founded the world-renowned Perinatal HIV Research Unit in Soweto, pioneering advances to prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission. Dr. Gray is also currently the co-chair of the J&J Phase 3 COVID vaccine study, along with scientists from Brazil and the US. Dr. Gray, thank you so much for joining us. I understand you are in Cape Town.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Yes, I'm speaking to you from Cape Town as the sun's going down over Table Mountain.
Well, we so appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Now, you witnessed the early days of the HIV epidemic in South Africa decades ago, and the pandemic and the crisis response that came along with it. And now, as one of the country's COVID-19 pandemic research advisors, has COVID been very different? I mean, what is happening in South Africa right now? And are there learnings that can be applied to the current pandemic from the previous pandemic of HIV?
Sure, I didn't think I'd ever live through 2 epidemics, but certainly in South Africa, I lived through a huge HIV epidemic. We have one of the largest HIV epidemics in the world, if not the largest. We have more than 7 million people who are living with HIV and one of the biggest antiretroviral programs. And so we were most of the HIV infectious disease doctors who were doing a lot of work in the HIV epidemic were used to help respond to the COVID epidemic. So that was useful. So we had a lot of people who understood infectious diseases, who understood epidemic responses, who were then used to help report to and advise the government. And so having this huge epidemic did help us. What was different with COVID to HIV is with HIV we had months to years to make an impact because people didn't die immediately from HIV. Whereas with the COVID epidemic, we found ourselves having to make decisions in hours, days, and not even weeks. We didn't have enough weeks. And so we had to make quick decisions about going into lockdown and quick decisions about interventions, such as wearing masks in public, physical distancing and hand hygiene. So we had to respond we were making responses in hours and days, and that was the emergency was there. And so we did learn how to respond very quickly, and the good interaction and having scientists around did help the government to work with it. What we did find with the COVID epidemic was a mass shortage of testing. So at the time we needed testing, there was a global shortage of testing. We went into lockdown, and we further then could not get tests into the country. And so even though we were in lockdown, we couldn't ever increase our testing strategy. And so what we would learn going forward is to make sure that our ability to respond and test for next epidemic should be better.
And can you talk about the collateral damage to the healthcare system? I mean, how has COVID impacted overall care there?
So like the US, like New York, like everywhere in the world, health systems aren't resilient. And we've seen health systems not being resilient in the UK, in the US, and imagine a low middle income country like South Africa. We had tremendous collateral damage. We had a reduction in the amount of people who were getting their viral loads taken, who were HIV infected, and their treatment. And we also had a reduction in the diagnosis of TB, which meant a lot of people were undiagnosed and were transmitting in the community. We have one of the highest burdens of TB in the world, so not being able to diagnose and treat TB was a huge problem. Plus, we saw that our immunization rates for children under 1 declined. So we had a 25% reduction in immunization rates, which is very important because children die from infectious diseases if they aren't immunized. We also saw a reluctance of people to come through to the clinics, even for antenatal care. Women were scared of going to have their pregnancies evaluated because they thought they would get COVID at the clinic, and a lot of people didn't go and get their medicines because they were scared of COVID, and which means that people didn't get their diabetic treatment and their hypertensive treatment. We also had to reduce elective surgery, which means there are going to be endless queues going on, for hip replacements and other kind of cold surgery. So like the rest of the world, the health system has taken a knock. And as we've learned, I think going forward, we need to look at how to make health systems at a global level more resilient, and that we should be able to do our business of giving care to people without at the same time as responding to an epidemic, and not let the rest of the health system fail. And that's a very important lesson for us at a global level, the importance of health system resilience.
Despite the challenges that your healthcare system experienced, the African continent has over 1.3 billion people, but the death count in Africa has been lower than so many other countries, such as the UK, Italy, and the US. To what do you attribute this, and why do you think South Africa's mortality rate has been so much lower than expected?
So our mortality rate has been lower. We do think that some of the mortality has been underestimated. And so a lot of people may not have been diagnosed with COVID on their death certificates, and they might have died before they got to the hospital. So although we have low mortality rates, we do think our mortality rates are underestimated. So during the peak of we've had about 43,000 deaths, and of those, 17,000 have been attributed to COVID. So some of the excess deaths are probably due to COVID, but also due to the collateral deaths due to HIV, TB, and people not being too scared to come to the hospital and die before they get there. So what's more important is how many deaths happen during a pandemic, rather than how many deaths are just related to COVID. But we do think that having a youth bulge in South Africa and less old people made our mortality rates lower. We also believe that there may be genetic host factors that that rendered Africans maybe less susceptible, and there also might have been pre-existing protection from recent coronavirus infections that may have had some protection. But all in all, we did see a reduction. We don't have the ICU beds that you have in America, and we don't have the hospital beds. So it wasn't because we had good ICU or hospital beds. It was because there were other factors that helped us. Some of it was undercounting, but the others, I think, the demographics of Africa. We do know that in the rest of Africa, the burden of COVID was not as bad as in South Africa, but never at a stage in South Africa did we run out of capacity. There were times when we ran out of oxygen supply and we had to quickly move oxygen around the country, but most of the provinces were able to respond in an adequate way. We did do some interventions like alcohol prohibition and curfew to try and reduce unnatural deaths in our country, to make up space, to make beds available from trauma, try and divert trauma beds to COVID beds as we were managing the peak of the epidemic.
I'm always so curious about how those in other countries are responding to this pandemic. I mean, would you say that people there in South Africa have been more compliant with the guidelines, for example? I mean, I'm sure you know, here in the United States, masks have become totally politicized. Has that been the case in South Africa?
So we already, as we went into lockdown very early on in the epidemic, even before WHO recommended wearing masks in public, we recommended wearing masks in public, and that's regulatory now, mandatory. So if you don't wear a mask in public, you can be fined. We also implemented social distancing, and as well as lots and lots of hand hygiene. Wherever you go in South Africa, you have to wash your hands. As you go into a shop, you have to have your temperature taken, and you're not allowed to go into a shop without a mask. You're not allowed to walk in the road without a mask. You're only allowed to exercise without a mask on. We also banned religious gatherings, and we also that were greater than 50. We also very early on agreed that airborne transmission was important, and started to propagate less crowding, opening up ventilation, making sure windows and doors were open, and to reduce crowding and commuter movement. So we were very we pushed what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions, and wherever we got onto radio and TV, we said wear your masks, wash your hands, cough hygiene and physical distancing, open windows, and the country was very strict about mask wearing.
Dr. Gray, we have a lot of questions coming in because I mentioned that you are leading the vaccine trials there in South Africa. So Lucy from LinkedIn asked, will you include people of color and other people from disadvantaged backgrounds to participate in your trials?
So we are very good at using, we have very good experience of having diverse people who enter our trials. And so we have huge experience of having Black South Africans, people of mixed ancestry, Asian and white South Africans. So we do expect huge diversity. We have great experience in our communities. A lot of our sites are in townships, are in places where Black people live. Our community advisory boards, our scientists have been working in these communities since the HIV epidemic. So we've been very fortunate because a lot of the doctors and scientists who are working in the COVID vaccine arena have worked with HIV infected and Black people and have wonderful experience and trust. We've built a lot of trust with individuals in South Africa. So we're not worried about the lack of diversity in South Africa. We know that we will have diversity.
There is a great deal of vaccine hesitancy here in the US. Do you see much of it there in South Africa?
So in South Africa, we are very lucky and fortunate that a lot of people understand the importance, the public health importance of vaccines. We know that the introduction of pneumococcal respiratory syncytial RSV, as well as Haemophilus influenza and rotavirus vaccines have saved lives. And so we've been able to chart how under 5 mortality and our infant mortality rate has reduced because of vaccines. So we have a high uptake of vaccines, huge trust around vaccines. We've seen how it emptied our wards. Before we had the rotavirus vaccine, we used to have what we called drip rooms, just babies lined up during the rotavirus season with drips infusions in their arms. And since we've rolled out the vaccine, we've had to close down these wards. And so we know that vaccines work, and there's huge acceptance of vaccines in our country and high rates of immunizations. And that is why we were upset that during the COVID epidemic, less kids were able to be vaccinated in South Africa.
Speaking of kids, Joseph from Facebook asks, what is the best possible way to ensure that the children get the best testing in South Africa to make sure they do not have the virus?
So we've been very lucky, both in South Africa and at a global level, that children have been spared largely from the COVID epidemic. And if you look at hospitalizations and mortality at a global level, of the million people that have died from COVID, very little have been children. And so we've been trying to make sure that children in South Africa get to school. We also were very worried about our children not getting food. We know that in the US, 1 in 5 children went hungry under 12, and in South Africa there was a lot of children going hungry. And so for us, it was very important that children got food and they got to school, because we knew that they weren't the drivers of the epidemic in South Africa, and we also knew that they were less likely to be adversely affected. And so we did not want to punish the children by keeping them in overcrowded, impoverished households, and wanted to make sure that we could get them to school. We're very worried about school retention. We know that the quickest way to get into poverty is not to finish school. And so keeping our kids in school and making sure that we could feed them in school was very important to us. And so although our children did stay out of school, we tried to get them back even when community transmission wasn't very low.
And Dr. Gray, before I let you go, as I mentioned, you are leading the COVID vaccine trials there in South Africa, and you yourself have been injected. Why was it important for you to do that? And tell me what this response has been like.
So I joined the Chadox vaccine trial, and I joined it as a scientist. I'm not part of the team, so it was easy for me to volunteer because I wasn't running the Chadox trial. But I thought it was important to legitimize, to inspire trust. So if scientists themselves are willing to be immunized, it says that we trust the science, we trust the process of science. And so for me, it was about legitimizing the COVID vaccine trials. It was about saying that scientists themselves can be part of the solution. They don't always have to be. It was important for me to be at the recipient of a vaccine. Usually, I'm the one who's giving the vaccine. So it was an interesting experience to be a participant. It taught me a lot about participation, about meeting people in the clinic, engaging. It taught me about you having to have these nasopharyngeal swabs 8 times in the vaccination, having your blood taken. It was very important for doctors and scientists to participate, so we can also appreciate the contribution that people make to vaccine discovery, and that was very important.
Well, Dr. Glenda Gray, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us from Cape Town. That was Glenda Gray of the South African Medical Research Council with a very interesting global perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A reminder that you are watching The Road to a Vaccine. Please keep those questions coming. We are reading them and we'll do our best to get them answered. Now let's turn our sights to New York City, where rising cases are threatening a second wave. Our next guest is Dr. Matt McCarthy, Associate Professor at Weill Cornell Medicine and author of Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic. Dr. McCarthy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, so Dr. McCarthy, you were a physician on the front lines in New York, which was our hardest hit area by far. You sounded alarm bells about the fact that adequate testing was not available for patients. What is the status of testing months later? And would you say we are better at treating the virus now? And are you seeing any ongoing or new challenges in administering new kinds of treatment?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, but
Let
me just say, the reason that I was attuned to the diagnostic failures is when I was writing my book, the thing that I figured out was that with any kind of superbug, people are so often focused on new treatments and cures and vaccines. And what I discovered was if you don't know how to detect the virus or the superbug, we're going to run into problems. And it was back in February that I could see that people were coming into the hospital and we couldn't figure out what they had. And so I was the one who came out and said, this is a big problem. The good news is that we are doing so much better with testing right now. You know, in the United States, we're testing close to 1 million people a day, which is a pretty dramatic increase from where we were in the spring. The problem right now is the turnaround time. I've received 2 texts just this morning from friends who say, I'm going to get a coronavirus test, but they told me I won't have the results for 4 days. So we've got to figure out a way to get people more timely results. And I think that's the next hurdle. So we've made tremendous strides, but there's a long way to go. In terms of the treatment,
well, also it just also seems like there's so little uniformity in the kinds of tests that are available. You know, we hear about those that are taking, you know, hours to process, some that are taking days. I mean, there are nasal tests, there are saliva tests. I mean, it's kind of confounding.
Yeah, it's very confusing to people. Really, the most common question I get is, where can I get a rapid test with rapid results? And the answer to that is, it depends. It depends where you are. It depends what time of day it is. All kinds of things that are driving people to confusion. But the good news is that we are getting better at this all the time. And there's increasingly, we're having a better understanding of how to treat the virus. And, you know, that was the second part of your question. When we started back in March, we had no idea what drugs to use. You know, we started off using hydroxychloroquine because of some test tube data, which suggested it might work. It didn't. So we've moved on to things like remdesivir and dexamethasone, things you've heard about the president receiving. The mortality rate continues to plummet because we're doing a much better job at identifying who the at-risk people are and getting them drugs quickly. So I'm pleased with the progress, but we still have a long way to go.
Well, given that the death rate has been reduced because of these new treatments, should we still be as afraid of COVID?
Well, that's an interesting word that you chose because, as you know, the president said we shouldn't be afraid of COVID. I agree. I'm not afraid of COVID, but there's a big difference. I respect COVID. I've seen this virus strike down young, healthy people in the primes of their life. When I go into a room to take care of somebody with COVID, I'm not scared. I'm focused, and I respect the dangers that are out there. And, you know, a lot of people focus on the mortality rates. You know, people text me all the time and they'll be, you know, if you're under the age of 50, it's a 99.5% survival rate. That's true, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. What you're ignoring with that data is the fact that many patients are debilitated for months and months after the fact. You know, there are people called long haulers that just don't get back to their baseline normal functioning status, and they're not captured in that 99.5%. So I'm not afraid, but I have a healthy respect for the kind of damage this virus can do.
And I imagine that respecting the virus means adhering to the proper protocols, like continuing to wear masks and social distance when you are in crowded places, right? Or even when you're around other people. Can you still respect the virus and not do those things?
No, that's part of respecting the virus, is knowing that you might be able to withstand this virus, but you could pass it on to someone and kill them. So, you know, it's very straightforward here. If you're in a crowd, you wear a mask, you try to stay 6 feet away from people. If you have events that are coming up in your life, try to have them outdoors. We know that inanimate objects are not a major cause of transmission. It's usually person to person. And we see that places that are poorly ventilated are more dangerous than places that have good aeration. You know, we have a good understanding of this virus now. We can start this process of opening up and getting our lives back on track, but that absolutely includes wearing a mask and social distancing.
Right, respecting the virus and respecting other people. Over the last few months, there have been many instances of experts and public health departments changing their guidelines, which has contributed frankly, to more confusion and sometimes mistrust in the public's eyes. Can you explain why this happens and why we still really just need to believe the facts behind the science?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, remember, this is a virus that no one had any experience with at the beginning of this year. And the reason that there's so much distrust is because throughout January, February, and March, the recommendation in the United States was not to wear a mask. And it wasn't until April 3rd that the CDC switched their guidelines. And so what you have now are people who see experts coming on, and sometimes they have a political axe to grind. Sometimes they say things that people don't want to hear. And if they don't want to hear it, they can say, look, this person back in March was totally wrong about a really important issue. Why should I listen to this person? And here's how I approach that. If somebody was wrong because the science changed or they didn't know the science yet, I don't hold that against them. But if you do know the science, anyone after April 3rd who's saying masks don't work, well, I do hold that against them. But my approach to this is that back in March, back in February, there was a lot of unsettled science. But the reason this is so controversial now is that you can pick any expert and say, look, they were wrong about something, so I'm just not going to listen to them.
Well, we just heard Dr. Glenda Gray in South Africa saying, the people there in South Africa, given past experience with pandemics, have been compliant, and their mortality rate has been far lower than the U.S. Dr. McCarthy, we have some questions coming in. Mikhail from LinkedIn asks, vaccine on trial will likely provide immunity, but when can we expect to return to normal life and our usual daily routine?
Well, this is the question that
Yes.
everyone wants an answer to. The way I see this playing out is that you may see a vaccine get an emergency authorization towards the end of the year. One of the challenges is that vaccine may be difficult to disseminate, especially if it's one that's made using RNA, which has to be stored and transported at sub-zero temperatures. So you may see people saying, okay, there's an approved vaccine, but we don't have a way to store it. So let's wait for some of these other vaccines to get approved and then compare all of them. I anticipate that's what you're going to see playing out in the January, February. And then hopefully by March, April, we can start really disseminating a vaccine, especially to the high-risk groups. So I hope that by the summer, you're going to see fans in the stadiums at baseball games, and you're going to see people going back to normal life. And then, by the fall, fingers crossed, a year from now, we will start to say, hey, I remember what this life was like.
Do you think the only way we can do that is with a vaccine and people actually taking the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, that's the term that was used earlier in this broadcast, the vaccine hesitancy. That's going to be a real issue to overcome. The title of this project is called Operation Warp Speed. And for someone like me who's a clinical researcher, that gives me a little bit of pause, because one of the truisms in research is that fast is slow and slow is fast. And what we mean by that is the faster you push and you race, it's actually going to make it harder to convince people that you have a good result. And it's going to be harder to disseminate that vaccine if you race to get it approved. Whereas if you say, you know what, we're going to take our time. We can't even give you a day when this vaccine is going to be ready, because when it's ready, it's ready. We're going to do this methodically. Then once it gets approved, you can very quickly roll it out. So I caution anyone who's involved with trying to race to get this thing rolled out, because then it's going to slow down the actual dissemination of it.
Well, it's heartening that so many of the biggest pharmaceutical manufacturers have committed to not compromise safety in this process. Tony from Facebook, Dr. McCarthy, is asking, is it possible that COVID was in the US before December?
Very good question. The timeline on this has changed, right? We first heard about COVID in the United States in late January in the Seattle area. And then in Ohio, they say that they have antibody evidence to say it was in Ohio in early January. We don't know. We're still trying to piece together where this virus came from. Before I went into medicine, I studied Ebola virus, and I went to Africa and I caught bats, and I looked for deadly viruses in bats, and I found Ebola virus in bats. And we know that bats can carry all kinds of deadly viruses. And it would make sense for this virus to have emerged from a bat, possibly in China, possibly from a meat market. But those answers still have not been clarified. I think it is possible that this virus was in the United States, in California in December. I have some friends who live in Los Angeles and who said, I felt really lousy back in December. Could that have been coronavirus? We don't have answers to that yet. Hopefully someday we do, and it may involve doing autopsies on people who passed away in 2019 to find out if this virus was really here. So maybe the jury's still out.
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles, and I've had a number of friends say that last year they exhibited all the symptoms of COVID, and they definitely felt like it was different from what they had experienced previously with the flu. We have another question. Actually, sorry, it hasn't come through yet, but I know it came up on my phone, but they're going to send it through again. We are now 8 months into this pandemic, and we're having this explosion of cases in the White House, as we all know. What should we take from this? And do you think that, do you think COVID will be taken more seriously now, or less, just given the president's sort of cavalier attitude? And what should individuals be doing right now as cases are starting to spike in different parts of this country?
Right. It's the same message that I give anyone I advise on this, which is that we know that there are certain interventions that work. Wearing a mask and staying 6 feet away from people. Some people want to do the opposite of that. They want to do a rapid test every day so they don't have to wear a mask. But these rapid tests are often faulty. And letting your guard down with a faulty mask is a recipe for failure. So I would say don't follow what the White House has done thus far. I tell people all the time, do not look to that as the model for what your business should be doing. You should actually do the opposite of that. You should assume everyone could have COVID. Everyone around you could have coronavirus. So if you wear a mask and stay 6 feet away, you're going to keep yourself safe, and you can actually go live your life. You can go to the grocery store. You can do these things. People say that a mask is an attack on liberty. I don't see it that way. I say that, putting on a mask allows you the freedom to go do things in life.
Yeah, it is not even an inconvenience, really. If you know that you can possibly prevent transmitting the virus to other people, it's just a matter of consideration, as far as I'm concerned. Dr. McCarthy, Carlene from LinkedIn asks, do you think an important aspect of being successful when contracting COVID is that people need to be seen by their physicians quickly and urgently and not wait?
Oh, well, this is a tricky thing. We know that of the few medications that help with COVID, they need to be given early in the course of the infection. So if you get diagnosed with coronavirus 7 days after your onset of symptoms, we don't really have anything that can help you. So early diagnosis is crucial. But not everyone needs to be seen by a doctor. Not everyone has to be hospitalized or need oxygen. So it's incredibly variable. The key is that looking at your vital signs, that is one of the first things we think about if somebody is not doing well. If their heart is racing, if their blood pressure is plummeting, or if their oxygen saturation is dropping. And something really unique with this virus is that it can cause dangerous drops in your oxygen saturation and you won't feel a thing. And so I wasn't surprised at all, for example, that the president said he felt great. But the doctors were saying there was this plummeting of the oxygen level. That's classic for this virus. So if you feel unwell in any way, I would recommend seeking medical attention. I don't like to put it on the patient to try to figure out if they're sick or not. So if you're not sure, definitely reach out to your provider.
Given your role in this early on and what you saw in ERs throughout New York, what is your projection as we head into the fall and temperatures start to drop precipitously?
Well, I just got my flu shot, and I'll remind everyone it's a good time of year to get your flu shot. The good news is that we always look to Australia and South America to see what the flu season is like there, to give a prediction of what we're going to see. And there's very little flu activity down there because people are wearing masks and social distancing. So I'm optimistic that we're not going to have an apocalypse this fall where there's this twin pandemic of influenza and coronavirus. In fact, I really don't think we're going to see much flu activity. In terms of whether or not we see a major uptick with coronavirus, it's unclear. I don't think we're going to see lockdowns across the country the way we did back in the fall, back in the spring, because so many people are wearing masks. So many people are following the rules. You're going to see little hotspots, and the key will be to aggressively target them and to limit them as quickly as possible. But I'm optimistic we're going to get through this and hold things at bay until a vaccine is available.
Yeah, I got my flu shot too, and glad I did it. Dr. Matt
Yes.
McCarthy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Such important information.
Thank you.
Now, while it seems like there's still a lot of uncertainty right now, one thing we do know is that social distancing and wearing masks do make a difference and are as important as ever as we head into the fall. I'll leave you with the story of a COVID-19 patient advocate in Sweden who has decided to speak out in a very unique way. We'll see you back live on October 20th on the road to a vaccine.
I really don't exactly know where I got the virus. I had a test before and it was negative. I felt something was going on. I began to have pain in my hands, under my feet. It was kind of burning. I lost my smell totally. And then I understand, oh, this may be COVID-19. I met a doctor at the hospital and he took seriously about my symptoms and said this is COVID-19. And after 2 months, that was in the middle of June then, I got worse. They didn't accept kind of that I have a clinical diagnosis because I haven't had this positive test in my nose and throat. They said that you are making it up. This is not seriously. You are not sick. Told me and my husband we have to do this on our own. I started to communicate with several scientists, and then I got to understand that there was no money for research concerning this in Sweden. And at one press conference, our Minister of Social, she said at the press conference that we have managed this, she said. And then I thought, who is we? Or what have been managed? And then I said, I think I would do a Greta. You know, Greta Thunberg, she had been demonstrating here in Stockholm. And then I said, I will come up and sit down outside the government and I want to know what you are meaning when you're saying we have managed it. We must fight for our rights to be respected. I would do anything to go to work tomorrow. You have to get knowledge, and we must help each other.